Hi, my name is Franklin Weber, and I am the Training and Technical Content Lead here at Chef, and I'm excited to run you through this particular bit of content here today. I'm actually just going to be using the PDF that's included in the attachments. The presentation, I believe that the PDF's the correct one, I believe, that I've linked to. I think I might have had an issue with the attachment itself, the PowerPoint, but don't worry about it. So, like I said, I'm the Training and Technical Content Lead here at Chef. I do a lot of material generation and stuff like that. You probably see me in various other webinars. So it's important for me to just lay some groundwork. Of course, you get an idea who I am. I want to make sure you have an understanding of who I think you are. When I put together this content, I assume that, of course, you manage chef cookbooks. You author and maintain them in some way, and then you have some experience writing chef spec tests, and you're interested in learning about more of those. What that actually means in terms of the tactical sense, if you're watching this video and that doesn't quite fit you, there's a number of other resources available to you that you can sort of take a look at down here. So this is something like you could take a look at this webinar, test-driven cookbook development, or write great unit tests. And of course, if you've taken any one of our training sort of things, that would cover it as well. Cool. All right, so what you're going to learn today, we're going to focus on testing resource guards. Particularly resource guards are those operations in our resources that make them item potent, essentially adds an additional sort of check to the test and repair to make sure that they don't take action unless they absolutely have to take action in the right scenarios. We're also going to take a look at testing helper methods. So oftentimes you'll be writing some guards and you'll be putting yourself in a position to work with helper methods. And we're going to see a little bit of that as well today. So I'm going to spend some time sort of showing you what happens when guards get a little more complicated, how we'll refactor the helper methods, and how we can test those. And then finally, if we have time with our attend today, we're going to look at a way for us to do some testing around search and data bags. So particularly the search around roles and nodes and things like that, and how to sort of continue to look at stubbing and sort of controlling our environment so that we're able to test things correctly. The schedule here is we're going to do this introduction for just a minute or two longer, and then we'll get right into the techniques. At the end, we'll save some time for questions. And of course, I'll wrap up by giving you access to a number of links and resources. And so what is important, though, is if you'd like to follow along with a number of the code examples that I'm looking at today, you can find them here in our Chef Training organization. You can clone that repository. I'm using the Testing at the Edges repository, and so you can clone that locally to your system, and you can see all the examples that I'm working with and probably a few more that I may or may not get to. Anytime during this presentation, I'd love for you to ask a question. So there's a questions tab down below. There's also a way that you can provide a comment if you're not interested in asking a question. So you can rate this and provide feedback. And of course, if you're interested in sharing this presentation with those within your team or those in your technical community, the details tab has that access for you so you can quickly and easily share that. Now, it's important to know that after today, the webinar is going to be available here at the same URL that you're viewing it now. So you'll see an email later telling you when the recording is available. That's for you to sort of store, keep, and share at a later date. So yet again, welcome to Testing at the Edges. My name is Franklin Weber, and let's get started. Okay, so our agenda today is looking at those three things that I wanted to talk about, the objectives that we're covering. So I want to start with first testing resource guards. And then we'll move into helper methods and then search like that. All right, so I want to start really from live. I want to do a lot of this as live and sort of walk through a lot of these things. So I'm going to move to my terminal inside of that Testing at the Edges repository. I need to do one little bit of cleanup for the moment to get things that I need, and then I'm ready to go. So I've taken the Testing at the Edges repository. I've deleted all the work that I'm actually going to be doing today. And so you've got the completed version if you're looking at the repository right now. I've got one that I've taken some pieces out of. And so it's going to be a little bit interesting for me as I sort of fill in those details. So our story starts out with the idea that I want to start working with my cookbooks. And I'm using my cookbooks, and I want to cover testing, right? I come in on Monday, I meet with my team, and we've finished the delivery of a deployment of our application or some cookbooks that are deploying some part of our application. And what we want to do is figure out, how can we make sure that our cookbooks are more reliable and we get fast feedback in our build system or our build environment to make sure that they're working correctly. Now, I'm going to show you a very simplistic cookbook, and this SSH cookbook is where I'm going to start. There would be more information inside of this cookbook. I've just, at this moment, sort of refined it down to just the very bare minimum to kind of focus us in the right area when we're working on this problem here today. So here's an execute resource that enables SSH on a Macintosh computer. So this is my Macintosh OS X system. I think OS X is going to give me the ability to enable remote logins here. And this is the execute statement that'll do that. Now the thing is, I don't want the remote login to be set every single time that I run. And you'll notice that I can solve that by essentially setting up this guard clause right here. So this guard clause that says not if. And this is executing a similar command as we see that sets that remote login. But in this case, it asserts that I'm going to get the remote login value, and then I'm going to make sure that whatever that value happens to be, I'm going to look for the word on within it. I'm going to take just a quick moment just to kind of show you what that looks like on my local system. So here, I'm going to do the get remote login on my local, I'm going to get the remote login on my local system. I'm going to run that. Oh, and I need to run this as a root user. So here we go. I'm going to run this as my root user. And we'll see when I execute this with the correct password, I will get information back when I execute the command. Well, I would promise you it would if I actually executed correctly. So it was working just a moment ago. Oh, the live demos. Well, essentially, when you execute this command, it's going to give you a value on or off, giving you sort of just the flag for that particular thing. Now, let's take a look at our specs for a second. Thinking about coverage and what we're doing here. What's interesting is that if you look at this sort of examination of this test, I have what is a default chef spec test that's looking at whether the default recipe for the SSH cookbook does everything it's supposed to be doing. So in this case, we're on a Mac platform. I'm just using 10.12. This can be CentOS or Ubuntu, whatever, particularly for your case and your scenario. I have my, of course, generic test which says it converges successfully. This is really the test that's just assuring me that I am running this and that, as we call it, the canary in the coal mine, ensuring that everything is working correctly and that there's no sort of particular issue in this moment. However, I have a test along here, which is this right there, which is saying it enables SSH. And I'm stating that I expect the chef run to execute this enable SSH resource. So if we return back to, or if I split the screen here, if I split the screen here and look at that recipe again, right, this is that resource that we're talking and we're making an assertion about. So by default, generally, this resource is going to take action unless this command is returning the value for me or not. So what I want to do now is look at coverage then. So this is something that often comes up when you start testing towards the edge of the thing, when you get started into the more complicated testing, is you start with looking at what is coverage and how coverage can sort of help you and guide you to write the correct test. But I also want to talk about some of its pitfalls as well. And so that's what we're going to be working at this moment right here. So here we are in the SSH cookbook. I'm opening up the chef spec helper file, and I'm going to add a very important line here, which is going to say, please, chef spec, start giving me coverage reports to see what I am actually testing and what still needs to be tested. So I'm going to add that line right here, and then I'm going to return to the terminal, and I'm going to execute my test. Okay. Clear the screen here, and then I'm going to move into the SSH cookbook, and then I'm going to execute my test suite running chef exec rspec. And this is going to execute my suite, and then it's going to give me a coverage report. In this case, also give me an error because I'm not stubbing some particular commands. But you'll see here, it gives me a chef spec report at the end telling me what my coverage is. And it's telling me, of course, I have one total resource. In this case, 0 resources have been touched, and so I've got a 0% coverage. And of course, I've got my issue in this case to solve, which is the error that is presenting to me. So when you start working with resource guards, I oftentimes enable coverage, and we'll talk a little bit more why enabling coverage is important. But just to kind of give you an idea of where we're at in the coverage at this moment, I've got a lot of coverage to make up for. And you see here, when it executes the test, it tells me that there is an error. It tells me that I am executing a command, and it's suggesting to me that I actually use this command right here to stub the value that I'm interested in stubbing, right? Essentially, I don't want to run this real system command, so chef spec is preventing me from doing that. So I'm going to return back to my, essentially to my recipe here. My spec file here. And I'm going to look at essentially my spec file. And what it's asking for me is it wants me to use this stub command. Now, the thing is, I can put the stub command in every one of my examples here, right? This would actually make the test pass. I would add the stub command, and then I need to actually put a value. Let's put false in this case. That default doesn't give you any sort of default there. There we go. So I'm going to add false, saying like, hey, we want to make sure that remote login is not actually present on the system. And you'll see that this passes for me, and it gives me the coverage report that I was hoping to see. So this solves the problem. And chef spec's really nice about showing you how to stub a command pretty easily and successfully here. And you'll see that, like I said, my coverage is 100%. I'm doing great, and I feel pretty good about myself. Now, I'm going to do a quick refactoring and just move this stub command into what we call a before block. So in a before block, this is going to be executed before every example. It's the same as what you saw before. The stub command is present in each one of these things. Essentially, this just gets executed before anything, and this is evaluated, right? And this gets executed again before this gets evaluated. So we're continually stubbing the command for each one of these scenarios, or in this case, each one of my examples. Great. So I see again that I have the coverage that I'm looking for, my tests all pass, and things like that. But here is a downside of coverage and sort of consideration when thinking about resource guards. Resource guards are a decision in your code, right? So when you're working with resource guards, you've got to think about it like this, right? In this case, we have an execute resource. This execute resource is going to normally just take action every single time, right? That's what usually our execute resource does. I like to think of it as like a big hammer. It just keeps doing what it's doing all the time, and really it does nothing else. But when we add a resource guard to this situation, what we're doing is we're actually putting some decision logic into this thing. So right, we're saying is don't take an execution, which is saying, well, don't always execute. Right, we're adding a sort of question here, which is saying, hey, does this remote login, is this set up? Remote login, right? Is remote login set up or on or off? So we've got an on value and an off value. So when it's off, we actually want you to take action, right? Which means we want you to execute the resource, perform the operation. When it's already on, we want you to take no action. So it's important to understand that when you add one of these guards into your system, you're actually putting branching logic into your code. And while coverage, as we saw that I executed, is telling me 100%, we are not actually testing 100% of your, of the code. So be aware, if you're working with this, like you come in on that Monday, you're saying we want our cookbooks to be better, and you're starting to sort of develop your cookbooks and sort of work towards covering a lot more of the cookbooks that you're interested in, you're going to see that coverage is going to be helpful, but it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to give you a complete report about how these things are executing correctly. So what we need to do is actually, like I said, come in and look at a way for us to test both of these code paths within this system. All right. So to do that, I'm going to return back to the spec file. I'm going to close these other files here just to kind of give me a little bit more room. And I'm going to think about this scenario right here. And really what I'm looking at is, well, let's move this up here. This is a particular scenario. And this is how you should think about these sort of branching logic. This is scenario one, right? So this is the scenario or the context in which essentially the flag is off, right? So we have the flag off. So remote login is off. And then we have another scenario which is not being captured, which is the scenario where the remote login is on. That's essentially what's not being covered here. And so we need to define both of these. But before I define this second one, I want to take a moment just to sort of define this first one and make it a little bit more clear. So I'm going to use what we have in essentially our spec that's available to us in Chef spec is the context helper. And this context helper allows me to describe a scenario. And oftentimes you start the sentence with this, which is when. And we could say when remote login is not enabled, right? And then we have another scenario, which is that one down below, which we'll write out. But I'll quickly move this code in here to describe this more clearly. Right. This doesn't change much in terms of the execution. The context is really just a way for us to encapsulate all the helpers or before blocks, any of the examples inside of here, and just places it in its own example group for clarity purposes. The nice part, of course, when you execute it, you're actually going to see, and let me, excuse me, this needs to be in one of these. So let's just move this down into here. Yeah, I'll do that there. So this is going to execute, and I'm going to essentially see a little bit more information when I'm working with this right here. So if you'll notice here, it says when all attributes are default on unspecified platform, when remote login is enabled, it enables the SSH and it converges successfully, right? So that's a little bit more clear about what the scenario is, and that's something that's really important. Now, we still don't have the coverage we need. We need to write the remaining scenario for us to get things started. So I'm going to write this new scenario, which is when the remote login is on. So I'm going to write another context block. And in this, I'm going to say when remote login is enabled, in this case. And inside this context block, I'm going to copy the same sort of functionality here, make it a little bit easier for me. And really what I'm changing is this right here, which is true. Now, I'm going to make sure this test fails first. So I'm going to put this incorrect expectation, right? This is the correct expectation up above. When this is already enabled, when essentially we find the value and we return true, essentially what we're saying is that SSH is already enabled, so we really shouldn't do this. So this is not going to happen or shouldn't happen. And what we want to do is see a failure here just to make sure that our tests are working for us. All right. So there we go. You'll see here in the output, it's telling us that execute enable SSH in this scenario. So SSH default, when all attributes are default. On an unspecified platform, when remote login is enabled, it enables SSH, right? So this is what we're looking for. And of course, what I should redo is rename the sort of example here. Enables does nothing, right? Really it says takes no action. All right, so that's how we go, takes no action. And now we need to actually change our expectation to be like that. Now this is always tricky because you're like, well, what's the right way to express that, right? Do I say like, well, the action then, you know, because if you know this from familiar with working with resources, this is usually the action name, right? What action they're taking. That's the resource itself, right? That's the resource, and that's the name of the resource. So none of the resource or name changes, but the action changes. And when I first started working with Chef spec, this is how I initially wrote it. I thought this is exactly how you're supposed to express it. Of course, when you execute this, it totally doesn't work for you. Nothing execute is not a correct way to describe it. That's not how it works. This is the subtle little trick that you work with it, and how do you sort of get the resource you need. So we need to say, how does it do nothing? Well, for us, what we need to do is grab the resource. And we need to grab the resource from the chef run. Chef run allows you to grab a resource by the resource type, and then we specify the name of that resource, in this case, enable SSH. Now that we have access to that resource, we can specify, I expect the resource to do nothing, right here. So this is the correct way to express when a resource takes no action whatsoever. So I'm going to run these tests and take a look at that and see the results. And there we go. Right, so now we have our two scenarios, when remote login is enabled and when remote login is essentially not enabled or already, right? When it's not enabled, we enable it. When it's already enabled, we take no action and convert successfully. So we've created for us actually what I would consider 100% coverage. So while you might be looking at coverage and as a tool to sort of help you or instruct you, as you start working with essentially your cookbooks and trying to cover more ground within your cookbooks, I encourage you to really only use coverage as a way to sort of guide you. But be aware that you created scenarios, particularly like in this resource right here, you're creating branching logic that allows you, or in this case, is going to create multiple paths through the code. So it's important to test all those paths through the code if you're working with it. And just one quick aside about coverage itself. Something that I like to think about when working with coverage is that coverage is not the be-all, end-all, right? So we're not worried about coverage. Like a lot of people on a team will say, we must have 100% coverage. Now, and this is my take on 100% coverage. When I'm working with code, it's one thing. When I'm working with code like actual Ruby code or any kind of Java code or something like that, 100% coverage makes me sad because what you're going to be doing is testing things that you really shouldn't be testing. 100% coverage is a bad thing. Now, here's the thing is when I work with chef recipes, I don't want to say 100% coverage is great, but it does make me a little bit happier when I see that 100% coverage. A lot of times these resources need to be covered to sort of prove that they're valuable, but these are the situations where you're going to run into some particular trouble when you're working with these chef things. In this case, the coverage itself. You're going to see problems when you do some refactoring. So in this case, imagine in the future, we were to replace this with some sort of SSH resource on our Macintosh computer here in Mac OS. We would sort of replace this with this thing, and we would say SSH, maybe we'll just call this Mac OS X, SSH, right, whatever that resource happens to be, and it would be something like action enable, right? As we refactor our code here, and I guess we put some sort of name here, whatever that designer or whoever put up this sort of resource together, when we put this together, he or she essentially has created this new resource. When we execute our tests again, we're going to see failures. And the reason why we're going to see these failures is that we are tied to the original implementation of the recipe that was expecting the execute resource. So as you get or strive for 100% coverage, be aware that you may be testing or sort of putting expectations on resources that may disappear. So it's important that if you are striving for 100% coverage or you're striving for a high percentage of coverage, be careful about the resources you're making assertions about. All right. That's just kind of an aside here, something that I always like to talk about, particularly with this. So again, this example is inside of that repository, so you can take a look at that. Let's take a look at now another example, particularly when we start looking at helper methods. So I'm going to return back to the slides here just to kind of say, yep, we're testing resource guards. Let's take a look at testing helper methods. So helper methods usually are not something that we create initially. Some of us, when we're working with our cookbooks, we do. I want to explore particularly moving from a resource guard into a helper method when you want to do that. And in this case, perhaps we'll even get into testing a helper method, a very complicated one inside of one of the example cookbooks I provided in that repository. All right. So let's return back to our code sample here. I am now going to look under the AAR cookbook. So this was another cookbook that was called the Awesome Appliance Repair. Inside of this cookbook, it had a lot of different steps. And again, I've refined it down to just this execute resource, which has a resource guard, which is looking for a file to be present on the system. Now, perhaps we're doing this because, of course, we're deploying this on both Windows and Linux, so we don't have a system-related command that works on both of them. Or the original designer essentially chose to do this, as the original implementation chose to use Ruby's file exists here to make this work. So, excuse me, undo that. All right. So this is another example of using a resource guard. So we can use resource guards as either strings, and we can use Ruby code inside of the block here. So between the do and the end, as long as the last command here is giving me a true or false value, essentially I can use those to make this work. Now, I'm going to go into the test for this file. And again, here we're assuming, right, on CentOS 6 right here, so CentOS 6.7. What we're saying is we expect it to converge successfully, and it installs the application, right? We want this to do that. So again, we're in a very similar situation as we saw with the last one. We're just now using Ruby code to assert whether to take action or not. So I'm going to first enable coverage, or coverage has already been enabled, which is great. So coverage is good to cover. But in this case, again, we are not going to see, or even if this works correctly, we're going to see 100% coverage, but that's not ideal, right? That's not exactly what's taking place there because we have this new branching logic. So I'm going to run chef exec rspec inside of this new cookbook, the AAR cookbook. I'm going to see that I have my 100% coverage and everything passes successfully. However, this is passing successfully because I believe this is actually executing the Ruby code. So it's looking on my local file system for this file. And of course, I don't have site/AAR/install complete marker file. Right? So this, apparently this old application isn't able to install cleanly. It needs this marker file to be in place. So what we need to do is create a scenario where it doesn't install. And so I'm going to return back to this file right here. I'm going to take a moment to place this into a scenario, right? So again, I'm going to use that context to create my scenario. So this is when the file, when essentially the application is not installed, install marker file is not present, and I'm going to move these inside of there, right? It installs the application, and then I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste this down here, and I'm going to change this for the purposes of my case where the install marker file is present. So it's not present, is present. It still converges successfully. It does not install the application, right? And I can, again, takes no action. So here we are. I'm going to do this based on what we saw before, and I'm going to change this. Remember, I'm going to find this execute resource. I'm going to ask the chef run object to give me the execute resource. I'm going to store that in the resource variable. And then I'm going to say, I expect that resource to do nothing, right? So that should take no action whatsoever. Of course, I haven't done, which is right here, which is the to-do, set up the scenario where that file happens to be present. And we're going to get back to that. But I just want to execute the test, show you again that structure. Whenever you're dealing with resource guards, you need to look or think about these two different scenarios, when it takes action, when it doesn't take action. All right, so I'm going to move into the cookbook like this, and I'm going to execute the test again. I believe I'm going to see a failure here as my expectations should fail. Right, so in this case, I expected it to not take action, to do nothing, and of course it didn't run. It actually ran because the file does not exist. So this is the moment where within this, or in a before, you know, I would actually write before to end. I need to come up with a way to stub out the functionality of this file exists. And that's when it gets a little bit tricky because you're like, this is not something I'm used to stubbing out. And this is where you need to be familiar with a little bit of RSpec and RSpec stubbing language. What happens is, you with RSpec stubbing language, you use the way to express it is to say, I want to allow an object, in this case file, to receive a message. And the message that I want to receive is this method that's being called on here. So it's going to receive exist, and I'm even going to say with. I'm going to say with this value right here. So this is saying with parameter. So to break it down more simply, the English language here that I'm describing, I'm saying I'm going to allow the file to receive exist question mark with this value, and then I get to return something, right? I can say true or false. In this case, I want to make sure the file is present, so I'm going to say and return true. This is just mapping one-to-one really to these things right here, right? So this is mapping right here. So the file is mapping right to there. To receive is really just showing us that the exist is that exist method. The with is just the parameter that we're providing here. The nice part about using a with is that we're making sure that we're only stubbing this particular instance. So when you call file exist with this value, return true. Otherwise, just ignore it. Just do what you normally do, which means don't intercept other files that might be being taken place on the system, other file checks that might be happening on the system. So this should work for us. And when I started working with Chef Spec, that was definitely felt like the case, right? Similar to, like I said, with that do nothing, I struggle with sort of figuring this out. When working with RSpec and Chef Spec, I came across this error right here, which is telling me that there's an uninitialized constant RSpec support differ. And none of this makes sense in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish. And the thing that I realized when working with it is that we are overriding this file.exist method. And I think this is very core to Ruby. Essentially, when you start working with file.exist and you start replacing it, you are replacing it for every instance of file.exist that exists with any Ruby code. So anything behind the scenes, any of the RSpec stuff that's working with it, any of the chef spec stuff, if they call file.exist, this stub is in place. So it's very dangerous to start stubbing things and setting up sort of false expectations on Ruby classes. Let me show you, take a moment here. I'm just going to show you without the with what kind of trouble you get into, which is saying whenever you see file.exist with any parameter, I want you to return true. If I execute this test suite again, what you're going to see is it's going to give me even a bigger error, right? Because I'm overriding file.exist, it looks like here it's trying to open up a particular file, and this file doesn't actually exist on my system, but of course, because I've stubbed file.exist as true, there's an error. It tries to open up this file. So again, it's a bad idea to start working with essentially Ruby's core files, and this is a moment where you want to start looking at creating a helper method to solve your problem. So that's what we're going to do here. So let's think about what we're really trying to express when we say file.exist and this file right here. Really, we could think about it as like, well, we're trying to say file.exist, but we're also trying to say, I expect, in this case, that the, let's say AAR or the, let's just call it the AAR application install marker is present, right? So application install marker is present. And of course, I'm a Ruby developer, so I love to make really long file names. Of course, I like to put some question marks at the end of that. Really, that's what this is kind of saying, right? We want to make sure the install marker file is present. And we can actually make this method real. If I execute this right here and I see this, I'm going to see a failure because this method is not, it does not yet exist. And of course, we're going to see a number of errors. Oh, I'm still, I think, overriding this function. Let's take that out and then execute it. And I'll show you that issue that I'm talking about. All right, wonderful. So in this case, undefined method AAR application install marker is present, question mark. So let's make this a reality. And it's telling us it's not present for the chef resource execute object. So I'm going to create that inside of here, inside of the recipe file. A lot of time when you start creating your own helper methods, you'll create it inside of the libraries directory. You'll go inside of here and add them there. But for the purposes of this webinar, I'm going to put it in here just so I don't have to open up yet another file. So first and foremost, you usually create a module. And you create a module mostly for namespacing purposes. And oftentimes you start with your company name, and then you use the end. So whenever you use a module or class keyword in Ruby, you have to end it with an end. Inside of here, we oftentimes might say helpers, right? We might be like AAR helpers or something like that. Now, that's just a convention. You don't have to do anything like, in this case, your company name. But it's useful to namespace, in this case, to make sure that we don't collide with other people. And that's a lot of times why we place these inside of there. I'm going to write this right here, this method. And really, I'm just going to take this code that exists already, and I'm going to move it inside of here and just place it in an end. Now, this doesn't automatically make the method exist on the execute object. I still need to bring this, essentially, this function or this method into my execute resource. And there's two ways of going about it. And the one way that I like doing it sometimes is this, where I'm going to ask this particular execute resource to extend this functionality. So you're saying, hey, execute resource, you've got all this existing functionality. What I want you to do is extend that functionality, include these methods here, so that when I call them, it's going to work in our favor. So here we are. I'm extending this module that we just created. Again, normally this would be in the libraries folder. I'm then saying, now that I've got it extended, I'm going to have this method, and this method should work for us. Let me take a quick moment. I think I've actually got this installed or present right here. I called it a little bit different. I'm not including this one, but that's one way of sort of showing that it's present on the system. All right. So let's return back to the command line. I'm going to execute this. So this is hopefully going to execute correctly for the positive case, right? In this case, when the application install marker is not present, or I guess that's the positive case, right? Could install the application. But we're still not in the right position to solve our original problem, which is when the marker file is present. So I'm now going to return back to our test. And remember, I was doing all this stubbing for file and it got us into trouble. I'm now instead going to say any instance of execute. If they ever call this method whatsoever in this particular scenario, so in this particular scenario, anytime the execute resource calls this method, I want to make sure that it returns true. And you can do this by essentially using another one of RSpec's really powerful tools as far as like mocking and stubbing, which is called this. Allow, previously used allow. The thing is we want to make sure we allow any instance of the execute resource in this scenario. So I'm going to say chef : resource : execute. And then I'm going to say to receive, right, the same sort of structure I was writing before. I want to receive, I before ease, right? Receive this thing right here, essentially this method, AR application file, present, present. And now I want to make sure that it returns true, right? And return true. There we go. So that's it. So instead of using this file indicator, I'm saying anytime execute resources of any type, of any instance, calls this method in this scenario, and only this scenario, return the true value. I'm going to execute our test here, and I believe I should have everything, pass, but I don't believe it did. So do nothing, right? No, I forgot to update my expectation. So it's essentially no, that's correct, takes no action, takes no action. When is this takes no action? Is present takes no action. Yeah, it does nothing, so it's doing this thing. So not if it's present. Well, I expect it to run execute the following thing and return true. Oh, I'm sorry, return true is the file present, not if true. I think that's the actual thing. Let's do the other thing that I was thinking about. I think this is correct here. So it takes no action, resource equals the chef run execute install this. We've got the correct resource defined. Now we expect the resource to do nothing. So here we are, we have that resource do nothing. But it looks like what we have is, it looks like it is taking action, but the following actions were performed. So I think what we're doing is something a little bit incorrect here. I'll go back to my original implementation. So I mentioned there's two ways of doing this. I've seen success with this one, but I've also seen success where I use the chef execute, chef resource execute thing, and I'm going to say include the my : this. So there's two ways of doing it. Like I mentioned before, I've seen more success with this one. So while I've been suggested this one by other individuals within the chef community, I found that this one works more clearly. Now, this one is a little more, I want to say safe in the sense of like it works correctly in most environments, but apparently it's not working for me in this scenario. There we go. So this is what's happening here. All right, so that looks good. It takes no action whatsoever. All right, so let's ignore this one for the moment and go back to this. So what we've done is we said, hey, let's take the chef resource execute and include any of the methods that are present here. So we've sort of augmented every execute resource. We've given them this method right here. And thus now any execute resource across any one of our recipes can now use this method, which can be dangerous. That's why the extend is usually more preferable. But I found with testing purposes, this seems to work more of the time and work correctly. So here we are. This looks good. I believe I've got a working test. The only thing that I'd like to do to kind of clean this up is to make sure that I also convey that same information in the test above for clarity purposes, right? While it's not necessary that I do this, or it doesn't feel necessary, at some point in the future, someone's system may actually have that file. So it's important for us to stub it and clearly describe the scenario, both the scenarios, right? So in this case, the file is present. In this case, the file is not present. If we don't specify this, it could cause some problems. So what I want to do is make sure that we stub this functionality out as well. I shouldn't see any change to the execution of my stuff, and this should work correctly for me. So we're looking at good ways in terms of stubbing our helper methods to make them work correctly. All right. So let's return back. I think that's a good explanation of sort of resource guards. I've seen particularly this scenario happen or play out a lot. Like I said, usually the style.exist gets you into trouble when it's used inside of these resources, and this is the easiest way for me to get around that functionality. By essentially, when you don't, your best bet, or at least when I think about it, when you think about stubbing things in terms of the world of Ruby, RSpec, Chef, and things like that, it's best to start trying to stub the methods and classes and things that you own and not mess with any of the underlying technology as best as possible. Now, you notice it's really just a thin layer in between the work that we're doing here, right? I see that this is really just calling this method, so it's really a minor amount of indirection. But that minor amount of indirection allows us to sort of step in the middle there and intercept it correctly to make sure that we get the result that we want. Okay. All right. Now let's return back. Okay, so we've looked at some helper methods. There's a few more ways in terms of actually testing helper methods, and that's more of a chef spec example and RSpec examples and things like that. I don't have time to go into it, but I'll include it. I believe it's included in the resources for you. Actually, it's at the end of the thing I talked about. We've got a video that I can show you that shows you how to test those helper methods on our YouTube channel, and I'll get you that information, like I said, at the end. All right, so we've got a minute or two more. I just want to go into testing search. And of course, if you've got any questions so far, please do not hesitate to communicate them. So looking at search is an interesting thing to start testing. Testing search comes up very often when you start working with more complicated cookbooks, and particularly you want to have more dynamic cookbooks. So here I have a load balancer cookbook, and inside this load balancer cookbook, I tried to isolate it down to just the particular functionality I needed, but really what I want to do is focus your eyes on this part right here, not worry about the package or anything like that, but this functionality here. I'm essentially performing a search. I'm grabbing any node which matches this role. I'm then sort of converting all the nodes that come back into just their IP addresses. So this is converting all the nodes into just IP addresses. And I'm sending these IP addresses to my template that I'm using right here. So this is pretty common, straightforward stuff that if you're using search, you're familiar with it. Now, this is one of those moments where you probably think like, I'm going to run my coverage and I'm going to actually sort of do that to the ends, right? I'm going to add my coverage here. So chef spec, I'm calling coverage, .start. I'm going to go into my load balancer cookbook and we're going to see some lovely coverage here, chef exec RSpec. This is going to give me a coverage report and tell me that my testing is looking good. Now the thing to be aware of, again, is when you start looking at this coverage and you start executing this. And of course, this is going to give you an error about the stubbing of search, and we'll get to that. But if this was correctly stubbed or working through, remember that in this case, that your search, when you kind of stub or sort of work with this, to just say return nothing, you know, this resource is not really going to take action. This resource is going to take action, but it's not going to write the right content. So let's look at a way to write a good test for this thing. Okay, so here we are. Here's a test for the load balancer default recipe. I'm going to use a solo runner. I tried, and I have for the last few weeks, been trying to work with the server runner to do some testing and sort of do some stubbing with nodes, but I haven't been successful with it. So if you have been, I'd love to hear from you. I haven't been successful with that functionality at this moment. Okay, so here we are in the load balancer cookbook. I am going to solve this problem by first essentially setting up, it writes out the correct template. So I'm going to say it writes the correct template. Remember, and I'll split the screen again, remember here I've got the spec, and inside of the default recipe, I like to keep the recipe up top here. Let's open up the recipe up top, put the spec down below. Inside the recipe here, I'm converting all these IP addresses, and then all these IP addresses are being sent to this template. So these IP addresses are working for me, and I need to make sure that they get written out to the file correctly. So I want to make sure that it writes out the correct template for me. And what I mean is I expect the chef run, right, to render a file. So it's going to render a file, this template file, this particular file right here, with some particular content. In this case, is some IP addresses that I'm sure that are going to be present in the system. And these IP addresses don't yet exist, right, because I only need to stub this content. I'm going to make sure that works. So if we look inside of this template file, you would see when you set up this load balancer that it should be every line in the thing should look something like this. It should say server, then you should say an app name and essentially the server name, and then you should have an IP address. And so that's what we're going to make sure is inside of our content. And this is something that I'm just going to write up, right? I'm going to make this information up, and then I'm going to make it true by stubbing the material to make sure it's working correctly. But first, I'm going to execute this and see this failure. Again, because it's going to tell me, hey, you're not stubbing the search. So let's actually stub that search inside of here. So the first and easy way of doing it, I guess, before this expectation, is to say, you know what, let's stub the search, right? So I've got my runner. I want to make sure that before I execute any of my tests in this scenario, I want to say stub search. So when you use a Solar runner, use the stub search. Whenever you cross a node object with the role web, these are the results that I want you to give. And the initial version is just give me an empty result set, right? That's a simple enough examination of a test. And so this is where you'll run the test again. And I think I'm going to get, writes out the correct template. I think I'm getting is an incorrect thing from file. Expected exception got, in this case, configured to no, I think it said was Solar runner with the correct template. It's configuring notify resource. Resource. Sorry, because I commented some things out to sort of highlight this to you, I'm getting a few errors. So let's make sure I get this correct. Let me undo that. Excuse me. Yeah. So here we are. I executed the test. Let me scroll back to the top. I've got a failure here. This failure is telling me that when I wrote out this file, I expected to see this, but I got the following content here. So here's all the content that was written to the file itself. The thing is, at the bottom of this file is where it expects to see the 192.168.0.1.80, right? If I look at that template file to kind of give you an idea of what kind of content is expected to be inside of there, if I look at this, this is where I'm actually writing out my web servers. There's my server piece in which I'm writing out the content. My IP address is written out there. When you give me an empty set, essentially no result set back, of course, no content is being used. So while we might say like, hey, this works well for essentially a generic sort of use of it, we want to make sure that this template is writing out the correct information. We need to stub out this information and actually return something. So this is where you can actually put in, it's tricky. You're like, shoot, do I need to put in node objects? How do I really work with it? The easy thing to think about it is, if you look at any one of these recipes, the thing that's coming back, yes, it does say node, but really this is just almost like a hash. And so you can use a hash-like object when you start sending this information to sort of stub what you need. So I need to make sure I have a cloud key, and my cloud key needs to have a hash. And inside my cloud key hash, I need to have a public IPv4, right, just another key for that. And then that value is essentially the IP address I'm going for, 192.168.0.1, right? So that's that value that I expect to appear inside of my file, essentially in my template file. And I chose this again because that's the value I chose here. If I wanted to change this to something else, I can change this to something else as well. So this sets up my expectation that it's going to write out the correct content using the stub search material. And you see here, if I execute it, everything is working correctly for me. So again, this search stub is very powerful. You can use it just to sort of generically, of course, remove the error by returning nothing. But I think it's important to start looking at ways to use real information or real-ish information to really describe the interface. The nice part about this, to kind of think about it, is that when you look at this when you examine this specification file, you'll see that this is the interface. These are the attributes you care about and the only attributes you care about when working with it. And you can see in the event of like, if I were to look for a different IP or if I see a failure when working with it in production, you know, maybe this is not under this. Maybe it's IPv6, right? So you need to come back and change your test and all that, right? You would see instantly and very quickly where you're going wrong in terms of the functionality. So it was a great way to design and describe the design that you've chosen for your, essentially your templates or any of the kind of logic within your recipes itself. Okay, so that covers that in terms of like covering our search thing. Let me return back to the slides here. So testing search, that's it. As I mentioned before, this was a solo runner, just an important difference. The solo runner is sort of simulating Chef Solo. I had a lot of success with this one when doing stubbing of search with node roles and stuff like that. What I've not had a lot of success with, which is using the server runner. So I was trying to figure out how to use the server runner, which is a little more difficult to work with. The server runner, essentially, what you need to do is, in this case, I would need to create a role. I would need to create a node and then set that node to a particular role. And I wasn't getting this to work correctly. This was failing. This was not failing, but wasn't helping me out. The search criteria was not coming back. I'm going to continue to explore that, and you'll probably see a blog post in the future to describe it. Okay. All right. So let's return back to our slides here. I think now we're in time for questions. So again, please let me know what you think and rate this presentation. Leave me any feedback or any kind of questions at this moment. We've got a few questions that I'm going to answer, and then, of course, you're welcome to submit any more as we continue on. All right, so let me get to the first question that I see inside the list. It says, can I set, let me copy this out because I like to do that and let you all see the questions that I'm answering for you. All right, here we are. I'm gonna open up this, a new thing, and I'm gonna open up a new editor window. All right, and here we are. Can I set server runner.new platform windows if I'm on a Linux machine? My unit test will complete correct. Yes, you totally can. Really what's happening when you're using server runner or solar runner and you're specifying that platform and that platform version, what you're doing is really telling Chef Spec to use FOHI. And FOHI is a gem that's faking OHI. So it doesn't quite state it here inside of the Chef Spec project or anything like that. But if I go to, in this case, I think Custom Ink, I've been there a number of times. Well, let's just do FOHI. I know it's Custom Ink FOHI. That's their project. If I go to the FOHI project here, this FOHI project has a lib directory. Inside the lib directory of FOHI, they have all the lists of platforms that you can support. So here's all the platforms. And if you open up any one of these, like in this case, your question was about Windows. I click on Windows. This is the platform versions I can specify. So I can say platform Windows, even if I'm on a Linux system or vice versa. And I can specify the version, essentially, of Windows that I want to test. That's definitely how you might use FOHI. So using a platform is pretty straightforward. You just got to find the right versions and right information. That's the part that I struggle with most, with where to find the versions that are accessible, right? So I was spending a lot of time on my Mac. I spent a lot of time on Windows, but I've not spent a lot of time on the various versions of CentOS or other flavors or Debian and things like that. So I wasn't familiar with all the versions. What was really powerful for me was to come into the FOHI gem and then look for the particular version in. And really, all this is doing is giving us fake OHI information. So it's a JSON file that describes what this possible system of this version is, and probably sanitized for the purposes of course, sharing with those people on the internet. Okay, that's a great question. Thank you very much. All right, so another question is, where can I find more resources to help me work through these things? So here we go. Let me paste there, yeah. Where can I find more resources? I'll answer some of that again at the end with that, because I'll provide some more resources for you. And yeah, let's go there then, because I don't see any more questions for us. So here are some resources, and I want you to take a look at the attachments that are included on this presentation. Inside the presentation, there are a number of attachments, I believe, down below. There are the slides from this presentation, which I think in the PDF format there. I had a little snafu with the PowerPoint file. I believe I deleted the PowerPoint file that I was working with today, and I have an older one that's included in the webinar section. So hopefully things are, I'll figure that out a little bit after this presentation. Well, there's the example cookbook I'm working with here, so you can take a look at this. The example cookbook contains a lot of these scenarios that I'm describing here and shows the completed working examples. So if you want to see guards, and you want to see guards with helper methods, and you want to see helper methods taught individually or tested individually, I've got a lot of good examples inside of there. Of course, some good resources to find out more of this information is the Chef Spec README. The Chef Spec README has a number of great examples for you to take a look at. And of course, they've got good examples on stubbing commands and stubbing search and how that might be used. Again, I'm trying to decipher and figure out, put together a good example for stubbing with the server runner. I've been seeing a lot of success with the solar runner. But other than that, I'm still struggling with that kind of thing. So I had another question here. Let me, before I finish up, there's a good question that came in here, and I want to make sure that happens. Thanks for asking it. All right. So let me wrap this again. What is the difference in declaring the execute resource and expecting do nothing rather than to not run execute? Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. Let's talk about that. And that's particularly interesting when we start saying that. Let's go back to one of the resources I was actually doing that with. And I think we've got a little time to do that. So I'm going to move back to the SSH cookbook, which I think had that functionality that you're talking about. And I'm inside that SSH cookbook, and inside that SSH cookbook here, let's go back and kind of close and reset. Close everything down, open up reset again. Here's that recipe, and here's this. And again, I wrote some command here that says to do nothing. So let's look at what you're proposing here as a statement, which is, what happens if I said just not to run execute? Yeah, that's an interesting one, because when you say I expect the thing to not run, say, enable SSH, I think that's okay. Now, the thing about that, though, is we could do this and we can execute this, and it's going to set up the right expectation and sort of work with it, right? If I go into SSH, I run chef exec rspec, it's true. It is very true that this is going to be a fair and correct expectation, because essentially, if we were to put this one up above, we should see a failure, right? If I put this alongside this one, this is the case is true, this is now false. If I run this, I should see a failure when working with it. And now that is absolutely right. But here's my one caveat to be careful when starting to work with this to not run execute. It's very simple for us to maybe put in the wrong name, right? In some way, shape, or form. I've definitely done this in some way. Like I've said, hey, enable SSH2 or some sort of different value. When I should probably put this inside of here as well. So I'm going to put this in both of those locations. So this sort of typoed version or this sort of expression in this way, you're going to see everything pass again and again. And the reason for that is because, of course, ChefSpec's saying, you know what? I definitely don't see this resource being executed, right? This resource is not in the resource collection. So this is something that is really not there. So it's my one thought. There's a difference between saying something is not in the list and explicitly stating that something is taking no action. So right here, what you're saying is, I expect this not to be happening, but this is just not happening even if it's not present, right? So that's something to be aware of. So typos and other things might get you with here. It's not always the case, but it's a little bit different. So this is explicitly saying this is in the resource collection and it's doing nothing. This is just saying I don't expect this to be in the resource collection, sort of taking any action whatsoever. So it's sort of a negation versus a positive statement. So that's a really great question and something that sort of caught me early on when working with it. And now I prefer to do a lot more of the do nothing sort of proposal. Great. Oh, it looks like we have one more. Yeah, thanks for bringing these questions in. Let's get this other one in. I'll try to copy this. And we've got about a minute or two, so I'll see if I can get this answered for you. Here we go. Okay. How would one approach notifies and subscribes of other resources within a context scenario? That's a great sort of series of questions. You know what? I've gotten more of those inside of this example that I provided for you at Testing at the Edges. There's a cookbook called the ARC cookbook in there, and this is an older version of the ARC cookbook, and I'll open this up for you. So your question, again, was, how do I approach notify and subscribe with other resources within the context scenario? Yeah, if you look at the ARC cookbook inside of here, the ARC cookbook contains particularly a lightweight resource provider. And in this provider, they have that scenario which you're describing, which is we have a lot of scenarios where this directory resource is essentially notifies this run, execute, unpack resource, which this is that resource down here. You notice that this takes no action whatsoever. Ultimately, when you start writing your test, and this one essentially does the same thing, it's sort of a domino effect. When this one falls down or takes action, then this one needs to take action, right? The set owner down below needs to take action. And when this one does take action, I think more of them take action. So there's a big chain of resources that take place. When you start defining it, I would take a look at the specs that I've written here. So I'm going to go into the default recipe. I'm going to show, I believe I've got that no dash, oh no, sorry, the default recipe is not going to give me that. I think I've got, here we go, it's in the fixture cookbook. So if you're interested in seeing an example of this, I have a thing called a fixture cookbook. Inside of there, I'm sort of using the recipe, or excuse me, using the resources given me a number of times. And I've got that fixture cookbook, and I've got the test inside of the default spec here. So let's take a look at one of these scenarios with the remaining seconds here. Take a look at this one. This is one where essentially I make sure that I create a directory, I get that directory, and then I set up expectations that they notify the other resources. So as you saw before, when using, say, the install example recipe inside of this fixture cookbook, I'm essentially making sure this chain of events is taking place correctly, and I'm asserting that every item in the chain is working. All right. So we've run out of time here. I appreciate your time and attention. There's a few more examples that I'd love for you to take a look at in the Advanced Dungeons and Testing Dragons presentation that I have on YouTube. A lot of good, solid content inside of there. This was a workshop I delivered at ChefConf in 2016, and so I encourage you to take a look at that. As always, I thank you for your time. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye.